I guess kind of where we start is we kind of wind it all the way back to, or wind it all the way back, and we kind of talk about what kind of got you into maybe interested in what your career path was. So it seems like back maybe when you're in high school, did you kind of realize that this was a career path, or were you just kind of not really sure what to do with your life, or kind of just taking random courses, things like that? Where were you kind of at?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think for the for your audience that's looking at career paths, it's important to spell out that when I got my first job in intelligence back in 1983, the internet did not exist. I know that an impossible thing for people to realize now in 2021, but not only was no internet, the organization that I joined didn't exist, at least not openly. And so when I was in high school, I realized that one of my passions and one of the things I was very good at was languages. I acquired languages very easily. I went on to do a degree at Western University, which we used to call University of Western Ontario, in London, where I'm from. I did an undergraduate degree in French and Spanish with minors in German and Russian, and a master's degree in Spanish. And when I graduated with a master's degree back in 1983, it was in the midst of a very, very bad recession across North America and, in fact, worldwide. And so jobs were very hard to get. Not only was it as an arts graduate, you had no hope of getting a job. Even engineers weren't getting jobs back then. So I didn't plan my career. In fact, when I was finishing up my fourth year at Western, I saw an advertisement in the what we call the alumni placement office at Western that said that the Department of National Defense (DND) was looking for linguists. I'm a linguist. And so I applied, as did everyone else in my program. Everyone else got a rejection. I got no answer at all. And so I didn't think much about it. I went on to do my master's degree. In the fall of my master's degree, the same poster went up, exact same color, exact same date. DND wants linguists. I applied again, and I didn't hear anything. And then I found out that they were going to be on campus doing interviews. And so I went to the office. I said, out of curiosity, my understanding is that these people will be here tomorrow to do interviews. Is my name on the list? Because I haven't heard either way. And the woman said, looked at the list and said, yeah, sorry, there's no Phil Gurski on the list. So I walked away. And as I was walking away, she said, oh, excuse me. There was a second page. Yours is the first name on the second page. You're the only name on the second page. You have an interview tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Uh, the letter asking me to come to the interview arrived the day after the interview.
Oh.
And therefore, had I not gone to the office and asked if I was being interviewed, I would have been a no-show.
Hmm.
They would have thought, hey, this Gursky guy doesn't care, so we're going to scratch him off our list. So, long story short, I did the interview. They were interested in my abilities. It was a job, and they said, "Well, we'll get back to you." 5 weeks later, they said, "We intend to hire you, but you have to undergo a security clearance," which I'd never, of course, received at the time. I had to fill in this long form with all my background, blah blah blah. 3 months later, I got a phone call saying, "Your security clearance is through. We want to offer you a job." I moved from London to Ottawa in July of 1983, and kind of the rest is history.
Hmm. Could you, I guess, go into kind of what I guess you mentioned it's a DoD, what the responsibilities are? Maybe talk a little bit about what you kind of did there before we kind of move on to your next kind of jump
Sure.
in your career path.
Sure. So Communications Security Establishment, or CSE, is Canada's Signals Intelligence Agency. It is part of what's called the Five Eyes Alliance, which is a post-World War II agreement amongst Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United States, and United Kingdom to share very sensitive intelligence derived through signals, which is basically intercepted, in those days, telephone calls, telexes, today more naturally, cyber communications. These agencies have the authorities under their respective legislations to basically vacuum up signals from around the world, not within their own countries, because that's protected under charters or constitutions, but foreign signals, to collect them, to process them, to determine if there's any intelligence in those signals, to translate them if necessary, and then to write it up in a very succinct way so that government clients with the requisite security clearance can learn about what countries X, Y, or Z are doing about issues A, B, or C. And so I did that for 17 and a half years.
Hmm.
Obviously, I can't talk about the targets that
Yeah,
I
for sure.
worked on. It was a fascinating job. It was the kind of job that, because my language profile was so broad, I was qualified to work in 12 languages. Every day was different. and I didn't know from one day to the next what I was going to work on. And obviously the topics varied. I mean, I started my career in the Cold War.
Hmm.
The summer I started my job, the Soviets downed a Korean airliner, a passenger airliner, killing 200 people on board. It was a major event of the Cold War, and there were fears it would, erupt in some kind of a war
Hmm.
between the Soviet bloc and NATO and the Western bloc. Very, very tense times back then. And then, of course, my career took me through the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 1990s, the era of enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, thousand points of light. The first President Bush called it, and then sort of up until the end of the 90s, we were kind of looking for new things to do because the uh, our mandate had been defined by the Cold War, defined by the Soviet Union and its allies, and now those guys were longer there. In some cases, they became our allies.
Hmm.
Think Poland, think Czech Republic, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole new world beckoned, and I think a lot of intelligence agencies were scrambling for a purpose.
Something else to do.
So for yeah, well, so foreign intelligence was always there, but we were so focused. In fact, when I joined CSE in 1983, I was a member of a team of 12 out of probably about 700, 800 people that worked there. Though we were the only 12 that did not look at the Soviet Union. We did the rest of the world, 12
Hmm.
people, because the Soviet Union was such a major concern for obvious reasons. And then as the world changed, the mandate had to change, and I think the focus had to change. So it was really a very exciting, challenging job, one that I loved, and I had a good time doing it.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned, at least, sorry, this is a little unrelated, but you said you worked in over 12 different languages. I think you studied what, Spanish and French, and you minored in
Yeah.
Russian and some other language. You were able to just
hmm
kind of pick up these languages through, I'm guessing, whatever work you did there.
Part of it was my natural talent for languages. So even though my graduate degree, I did degrees in French and Spanish, I also had a working knowledge of Italian and Portuguese and a little bit of Dutch as well. And then when I got to CSE, I was sent on Arabic language training, and then I taught myself Farsi, and I learned Indonesian. I picked up Norwegian. It just is languages that kind of
Right.
just
Okay.
occurred to me. So
Okay, that's awesome then. Would you say that obviously you have like a I guess an ability to learn languages way better than the average person. Would you say that a person obviously not taking any college courses in languages, they probably could still find a career path in this industry, for example. Like there's so many different
yes,
yeah, obviously so many
uh,
different areas that I guess the CSE or CSIS
absolutely.
yeah, could you talk a
Yeah,
bit about that? Like, how would someone find themselves maybe
sure.
pursuing a degree? Maybe if they don't have a university background, maybe they don't have like the ability to learn languages like you have,
Right.
things like that.
Well, it's really important for me to put a huge caveat in here, in that the CSC that I worked for is a very different organization today. So
Mm.
it still exists, but I think most Canadians, when they think of CSE, they think of the cybersecurity. So CSE is Canada's Cyber Command. It
Right.
is the agency that's tasked with ensuring that phishing attacks and denial of service attacks and lots of things I don't understand don't happen to Canadians, especially Canadian government systems. So I imagine that in 2021, what CSE is looking for in terms of people to work there are people that understand cybersecurity. So people with computer science degrees. There's still obviously a need for people that have background in languages as well, because it still has a foreign intelligence mandate. But the beauty of a place like CSE was that there were multiple career paths simultaneously. I worked as a crypto analyst for a year, and so we hired mathematicians
Mhm.
that were trying to break codes, trying to make codes and to break codes. We had physicists that used to work on certain types of equipment. We had computer scientists, we had linguists, we had just general analysts who are really good at getting at information and writing it succinctly. It was really an incredible array of people, and there were just multiple paths that were there. Again, I don't know what the sort of the current makeup is of CSE, because it's very much a changed
Right.
organization from when I left.
Mhm.
But I think the point is that what these organizations are looking for are just really smart, talented, passionate Canadians that want to make a difference in keeping us collectively safe. And the other thing that's changed big time, and this will be of germane to your audience, CSC regularly advertises. what it's looking for. They do a lot more job fairs than they did in my day. They become a lot more open. They're still a very secretive organization, but they've realized that being entirely secretive is counterproductive.
Right.
People aren't going to come work for you if they don't know who you are. And as a result, they're much more open than they were back in the 1980s.
Yeah, I guess compared to, or I guess today, I guess talking about CSIS, which is kind of the next, I guess, organization or Canadian branch. You kind of went to, CSIS actually came to my university, a
Mhm.
part of a career fair, I think like a year ago. So yeah, it probably makes way more sense that, kind of start advertising the possible, career paths. Because I mean, it's a very competitive field out there, especially for my field, computer science, right? There's a
Mm.
lot of, private companies that are really interested in picking me up. So it was really interesting actually to see, it's pronounced CSIS, right? Or C,
Yeah,
yeah.
CSIS, yeah, yeah.
Yes, it was pretty interesting to see the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, at my university, trying to kind of poach university students to come check out,
Yeah.
what they have to offer. And so I guess CSIS was kind of the next branch. I don't know
Yeah.
if branch, if you call it that, is kind of the next thing you kind of jumped onto for, a majority of your time.
Mhm. So what happened is that by the end of 2000, I've been at CSE for 17 and a half years. I worked always as a linguist. One of the problems that CSE had, and still has to some extent, is that, and this goes for across Canadian government jobs, it's really hard to stay within your specialty and advance in the Canadian government. Most promotions are based on a desire and a willingness to become management. So you can be the greatest physicist ever, but you're going to max out pretty quickly. To get ahead, to make more money, to get more responsibility, you have to become a manager of physicists. And so CSE didn't have a career path. I maxed out in the late 80s in terms of my career path. I still enjoyed it. That's why I kept doing it. But young family, 3 kids. My wife stayed home. Making more money wasn't a bad idea. And so when I realized that I needed to get further ahead, I actually tried for various competitions to become a manager and succeeded, and I hated it. I hated being a manager. I wanted to be an analyst. I wanted to get dirty with the data as opposed to managing people. And what happened was that a very good friend of mine who worked for CSIS realized I was struggling, and he said, "Well, why don't you just come work for us? We'll pay you." And that's what happened. So I accepted a secondment, so basically a temporary assignment at CSIS in January of 2001, and within weeks realized I wanted to stay. So I had to basically serve out the remainder of my secondment, which was a year. And towards the end of that year, 9/11 happened, and that changed everything for me in terms of my career. And then I realized, okay, we're going to make this formal. And long story short, by April of 2002, I resigned from CSE and joined CSIS permanently as of April of 2002, and spent the next 15 years there.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess obviously I was quite young when 9/11 happened, but it seems like this was kind of a major change in the way that I guess America, Canada, probably most countries handled foreign policy, and it seems like that
Mhm.
was probably, extremely motivating factor to, take on CSIS and kind of stay there and work, do what you kind of do. Um, it's also funny you mentioned kind of the idea of being pushed up to a managerial role. Is I hear a lot of stories in the computer science industry as well, where people are really happy, doing their programming, and then as they stay there, it's like, okay, you got to become a manager now, and the
Yeah,
managerial role is typically, emails, meetings, things like that. It's
yeah.
like, well, I just want to program, so it's kind of, I mean, it's not really surprising to hear that. I guess even public institutions kind of have that fault at times as well.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I did try to be a manager, and I realized that as a manager, I was bored out of my skull by 9 o'clock in the morning because there's nothing to do. You've answered your emails, you've had a meeting, and I thought I can't do this for another 20 years.
Hmm.
And so I went back to my original job, and then the CSIS opportunity presented itself, and at CSIS they were quite good. They recognized, because when I arrived there, I had almost 20 years experience in the business. They recognized they had something a little bit special here. So they were able to justify and get authorization to actually pay me as a mid-level manager, but I wasn't a manager. I was a senior strategic analyst for the organization, and that's what they paid me to do, to be an analyst, not to be a manager, but at a much more senior level. That would not have happened had I stayed at CSE, and so it was a good move for me at the time. And again, I had a job where it was a wonderful job. It was challenging. It was interesting. I think it was important in terms of what we did for national security and public safety. And I was just a very, very lucky Canadian.
Yeah, it sounds pretty awesome. You worked at CSIS for a decent amount of your career,
Mhm.
specifically researching Al Qaeda inspired violent radicalization, extremism in Canada.
Mhm.
Do you have any things that you'd want to talk about or mention about that? I guess it's kind of an open ended question. If not, we can
Yeah.
kind of move on to
No,
other things.
actually, if just give me 1 second
Yeah,
here.
go ahead.
Sorry, I have to do this. If you're actually interested in what I did at CSIS, um, I just published this book. It's called The Peaceable. I don't know if you can see it with the light. It's called The Peaceable Kingdom. It's actually available on my website. It's a summary of counterterrorism in Canada from Confederation to the present. And most of it, of course, is focused on the modern era, so from the 1980s onwards. And I had a job where I was basically paid to take a look at raw intelligence in terms of threats to national security and public safety and make some sense out of it, and to summarize it in a way that senior policymakers and decision makers could understand it and therefore use it in making their decisions. And it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, I worked on hundreds of investigations. Not as a I wasn't the investigator. I wasn't the person actually collecting the intelligence. I was the person analyzing the intelligence. But I had a very close relationship with those that did that, those that were actually responsible for running the investigations. We were in constant contact going back and forth. And it was a really exciting time. We did a lot of good work that saved Canadian lives. We prevented acts of terrorism from happening in Canada, and it doesn't get any sexier than that. It doesn't get any better than that. I mean, really. I mean,
No,
you're
it does sound awesome. You mentioned obviously the variety, right? Is coming into work every single day and having like a brand new thing to look at, to research to understand that constant idea of developing or obviously stimulating your mind to new ideas, not doing the same repetitive tasks because you have so many different varied things going on in the world. Definitely sounds awesome for sure, and obviously
yeah.
making an impact on the world. I actually read through your book, the the Threat from Within, which is your first book,
Yes. Mhm.
and there's quite a lot of I guess terroristic actions that happened in Canada that were prevented by the Canadian government. I
Yes.
was actually surprised at how many actually were about to happen until the Canadian government actually got involved and what's it prevented them. So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean it's that impact that you obviously have on the citizens of Canada as well.
I think most Canadians are woefully naive when it comes to this, and I think the reason for that is that when you're successful, you don't get a lot of attention, right? Oh, okay, something happened, something didn't happen. That's great. You get a lot of attention when things go wrong.
Mhm.
So think about, you talked about the threat from within. The cover photograph of that book is an Ottawa police officer on duty on October the 22nd, 2014. And this is in the aftermath of a terrorist attack on Parliament Hill, when Michael Zahafi-Bo went to the National Cenotaph. He killed Nathan Cirillo in cold blood and then tried to rush Parliament Hill, and he was killed by parliamentary security. Um, that was an intelligence failure. We didn't know enough about Michael Zahafi-Bo to be in a position to stop what he did. And that got noticed. When you mess up, when you make a mistake, fingers get pointed, questions get asked. Why didn't you stop this? And the IRA famously said this in the 1980s. The IRA being the Irish Republican Army, carrying out attacks in the United Kingdom in order to gain independence for Northern Ireland. They had a failed attack against then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, and they told her famously, uh, "You got lucky today. We have to get lucky once. You have to get lucky 100% of the time." And that's what happens in security intelligence: is that any mistake you make can be catastrophic in nature. I mean, just look at 9/11, right?
Right.
I mean, that was a catastrophic intelligence failure. Something went wrong. The intelligence wasn't collected properly, or it wasn't analyzed properly, or whatever kind of thing. And populations don't excuse you. They don't cut you any slack when you get it wrong. They don't really care when you get it right, because it becomes a non-story.
Exactly.
And in fact, in Canada, a lot of people will assume that, oh, it's CSIS made it up, or the RCMP made it up. There really wasn't any plot there. They just wanted to make it sound really big so they can get more money and more resources. but fail to stop something, boy, everyone wants to know why.
Yeah, for sure.
And rightly so. I mean, those are legitimate questions to ask, but I guess those of us who worked in the field would like to get some recognition when we get things right at the same time.
Yeah, no, coming from, I guess, a person that doesn't really follow Canadian politics too much. I'm too busy following American politics, I guess, like everyone else. It's surprising to obviously read the amount of, terrorism that I guess the Canadian government prevented. And,
Mhm.
I guess growing up, I guess the most recent attack was obviously the attack of Parliament Hill, or might one of the most recent ones. That
Mhm.
one I obviously heard about because it was obviously talked
Yeah.
on the news. It was a sexy headline for news companies to talk
Yep.
about, but I've never heard in my I don't think I've ever been taught, or I've never even heard about like events like Toronto 18, which I think was one
Yep.
of the ones that was prevented, right?
It's huge.
There is one that was mentioned. It wasn't Parliament, but somewhere in BC in my own province. Another
In Victoria,
or in
Canada
Victoria.
Day 2013, it was
Hmm.
a plot to explode pressure cooker bombs, which the couple that put them there had gotten learned lessons from the Boston Marathon attack
Hmm.
in April of 2013, and they plotted to bomb Canada Day when all the families were on I've been at the BC legislature. It's a beautiful building. It's got this beautiful grounds, and they were scheduled to detonate in the middle of the afternoon on Canada Day. And yeah, nobody hears about it because I mean, they were actually found guilty of terrorism, and then the judge threw the case out saying that they were entrapped by the RCMP. Terrible judgment by the judge. Terrible, terrible judgment. But it is what it is. I- you talk about sort of Canadians being naive. Let me go one step further. So last October was the 50th anniversary of the October crisis. This was when then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, declared martial law. He invoked the War Measures Act because a British diplomat, James Cross, and a Quebec minister, Pierre Laporte, had been kidnapped by the FLQ, which was the Quebec Liberation Front. They had carried out bombings in Montreal. They'd carried out bank robberies in Montreal. They killed 6 people. And when they seized a British diplomat, Trudeau said, enough's enough, and he declared martial law. Um, they killed Pierre Laporte. James Cross was rescued, and the whole FLQ kind of fell apart then. Last October was the 50th anniversary. There were op-ed pieces in newspapers around Canada saying it wasn't that bad. The government overreacted. The FLQ wasn't a threat. They killed 6 people. They wounded 200 people with bombings in Montreal that began in 1963 and continued for 7 years. And the people saying in hindsight, no, no, they weren't serious. They should have
Yeah,
been left alone.
that just seems ridiculous to me because I feel like if that happened today or within this year, I feel like that'd be a major news story, or at least people would be
Yeah.
talking about it way more. I mean, that even those numbers, because I haven't obviously studied the October crisis. I've only looked into it very minor, because again, another thing that I haven't been taught, at least in
Hmm.
my high school. Yeah, if I just heard those numbers, and it's like if something like that happened this year, I think everywhere around the world people would be talking about it. If members of parliament were being kidnapped, if hundreds of people were getting wounded. I mean, yeah. I mean, we obviously, I would say probably even the shooting you mentioned in Parliament, the last one. Obviously, I forget his name, but I feel like that probably even got like pretty good news coverage.
Yeah.
And obviously,
Well,
yeah.
but bear in mind too, you're a product of the post 9/11 era, right? I mean, so what year were you born in?
99.
Okay, well, you were 2 years old. Okay, so I mean, my eldest daughter was 12 on 9/11,
Mm,
and actually, I did a podcast with her, and I asked her what she remembered from that day.
mm,
She was in grade 8 or grade 9, I think, at the time,
yeah.
grade 8 probably, and so a lot has changed since 9/11. I mean, that single act of terrorism, 3,000 people dead, really changed everything in terms of how people viewed terrorism. Prior to that, nobody cared. I mean, even Air India, the downing of an Air India aircraft off the coast of Ireland in June of 1985 resulted in the deaths of 329 people. Nobody seemed to notice, despite the fact that it was planned and executed by Sikh extremists living in British Columbia. And most of the victims were Canadians. And yet, at the time, then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney issued a letter of condolence to the Indian Prime Minister, saying, we're so sorry for your loss of life. They were Canadians on that plane. Yeah, I'm sure they were dual citizens, maybe some Indian citizens as well, but it was a different mentality back then.
Mm,
Terrorism was not something anybody cared about. It
right.
was so few and far between, it didn't matter. And then again, on 9/11, with the deaths of 3,000 people, all of a sudden it mattered big time. And now we're living in what everyone calls the post 9/11 period, which has resulted in a lot of mistakes, a lot of good, but a lot of mistakes as well. But it's defined how the modern world looks at terrorism
Mm.
in ways that never existed before that. The other thing, which is really interesting, is terrorism as a field of study, part of political science, history, anthropology, sociology, whatever, was born on 9/11. Nobody studied terrorism before 9/11. Now, I say nobody, I'm exaggerating. There were a handful of people that studied terrorism.
Yeah, I
After
guess
9/11, everybody studied terrorism after 9/11.
you mentioned obviously your career path, right? You had 12 people assigned to the whole world, right? And then after 9/11, I'm assuming, that was the day that everything changed in Canada and obviously rest of the world in terms of how many, how much money I guess the government was going to allocate to tackle this issue. Um, So I guess if you're
Very much
obviously,
so.
yeah, if you're obviously interested in, checking out this career path, I mean, still even today, I'm sure even for the next 50, 100 years, it will be a massive issue that I guess both, countries all around the world investigate and look at. Um, so we kind of got a little off track, but you worked at CSIS,
Mhm.
and then probably did some, or it seems like you did some, sorry, you did some, just some minor work
I
here
did
and
a
there,
bit.
consulting work for the most part, after CSIS.
Yeah, yeah. So what happened is that towards the end of my career at CSIS, for reasons I won't go into, I took a job at Public Safety Canada, which is kind of the umbrella ministry, which oversees CSIS, CSE, the RCMP, Canada Border Services, and it's more of a policy shop. I worked in the National Security Directorate. Wasn't a really interesting job. It was more, I don't do policy. I'm more of an analyst. But one thing which was fascinating, which I was involved in, was what's called outreach. So I went across Canada with some of my colleagues talking to average Canadians about terrorism, talking to average Canadians about what does a terrorist look like? What do they say? What are their behaviors? And that was really interesting just to talk to average Canadians. Basically, it was an education forum. These are things you might want to know. If you start seeing stuff like this, you might want to call CSIS. You might want to call the RCMP because these are things that people knew nothing about. And so that got me into my decision to retire from the federal public service in April of 2015. My retirement lasted 2 weeks because I was snatched up by the Ontario Provincial Police's Anti-Terrorism section as a senior advisor. So the OPP, as it's called, had an anti-terrorism section since after 9/11, and they brought me in basically to help train some of the younger officers on terrorism investigations. So I did that for a while, but at the same time as that, the day I retired, I also created my own consulting company, Borealis Threat and Risk, where I continued to give lectures, presentations, training seminars. Yeah, you name it. I think I've been to 25 countries around the world since my retirement, speaking at various conferences and things like that, talking about terrorism, talking about what it looks like and things like that.
Yeah, you mentioned obviously educating Canadians about what terrorism really looks like or what a person who's going to commit a terrorist action looks like. Reading through your book, The Threat from Within, obviously painted the idea, at least maybe I had some misconception that most people had, is that a terrorist is essentially like almost a normal day Canadian. These
Yep.
people can be born from people that are making six figures, people that are like born in Canada, they're already inside Canadian culture and they have no issues
Yep.
transitioning. Like these are average Canadians, which is a complete different like misconception I had, or maybe I don't even know what kind of thoughts I had of what makes a terrorist. But it was very interesting to see, what makes a terrorist is just basically a normal person. Most of the time, it's just a regular person. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I think if you were to poll the average Canadian, they'd say, well, terrorists come to our country as immigrants, or or they're poor people, or they're not well educated, or I keep hearing this term marginalized, wherever that's supposed to mean, or they're mentally ill. A big myth about mental illness and terrorism. In actual fact, very few terrorists are mentally ill. No, you make the really good point, Matt. Terrorists are as or normal as you and me. They just happen to be people who have a grievance, and who have been led to believe that the only way to address that grievance is through violence. So look at any terrorist movement in history. Look at the IRA in Ireland. They've decided that negotiations were going nowhere. The only way to get Britain to give up the 6 counties of Northern Ireland back to the Irish Republic was to bomb. Al Qaeda believed the only way to get, rights for Muslims in the Middle East was to bomb the United States. Uh, right wing terrorists think the only way to ensure white supremacy is to bomb people or to kill people. It's the same motivation time and time and time again. Some of these movements are very religious in nature. So the my fifth book, which is When Religion Kills, talks about the fact that every religion has terrorist movements within it. I mean, we talk a lot, everyone, Islam is terrorism, and all these Muslim groups. There are Christian terrorist groups. There are Buddhist terrorist groups. Now that should be an oxymoron, a Buddhist terrorist, right? But there are Buddhist terrorists in Sri Lanka. There are Buddhist terrorists in Myanmar. There are Buddhist terrorists in Thailand. There's a monk in Myanmar, which is also called Burma, um, who has been one of the main figures in. Your listeners may not be familiar with the crisis in northwestern Myanmar, with the people called the Rohingya, which are Muslim people who've been forced to basically flee for their lives because the Burmese army has been slaughtering them, and they're being led ideologically in many ways by a monk, and his nickname is the Buddhist Bin Laden. That's not a good nickname, right? There are Jewish terrorist groups. There are Hindu terrorist groups in India right now. So it can be tied to any religious. It's also ideological. You don't have to be a religious figure. So the far right people don't tend to be religious. They're ideologically motivated. They're politically motivated. So anyone from all walks of life can become a terrorist. And then you get into this really unhelpful dialogue. Well, one man's terrorist and another man's freedom fighter. Where do you draw the distinction between those two? Who decides? Are terrorists the freedom fighters are terrorists the freedom fighters we don't like? Maybe. The African National Congress was a terrorist group in the 1960s, then became the government in 1994. So they changed from a terrorist group to the good guys overnight. These are really complicated issues, and I think that people really gloss over how difficult this thing is. It is really tough, and this goes, I think, is demonstrated in another way. No one can agree on what terrorism means.
Right.
There's a fellow friend of mine who works at he's a fellow like me at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism in The Hague. Wrote a paper like a decade ago. He did research. He found 200 definitions of terrorism. Those are just the ones he found. So if we have 200 definitions, how does anyone get a consensus as to what the word means and what it doesn't mean?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that your book does really is to make sure that you define terrorism, at least in what you think it is, or at least in the context that you're speaking about it. Because yeah, that seems to be a common issue, at least today. Is there's a lot of people throwing around the word terrorist for actions that may be terrorist. I have no idea, or could not be terrorist as well. It seems like the I guess media or political figures do that quite a lot nowadays. So um,
Well, let's take a very recent example. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January the 6th of this year. Everyone saw it because it was wall to wall news for like 24 hours, right?
mhm,
This was the session at the Senate, which was going to confirm Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential election. And this mob shows up and they end up, basically breaching the barricades. There wasn't a very robust police presence. And all these wankers and yahoos end up in the Capitol and they start destroying stuff and taking selfies and all kinds of stuff. Some people call that an act of terrorism. Some people didn't. I think it was complicated. I think that there were individuals that you could construe as terrorists involved in that. There are also rioters. There are also people that probably thought, holy shit, I came for a demonstration. Now I'm inside the Capitol. Now what do? I'll take a selfie. I'll sit in Nancy Pelosi's seat. I'll break a window. Is that an act of terrorism? Not at all. Some called it a coup attempt. Some called it an insurrection. Some called it an attempt to overthrow American democracy. A lot of exaggeration about what happened on January the 6th. And at the end of the day, if it was a terrorist attack, let's assume for argument's sake it was a terrorist attack. How many people died on that day?
from my knowledge,
One.
yeah,
One.
only one
One person was killed, a guard.
police
And even
officer.
there's a lot of controversy and uncertainty as to how he died. It hasn't been determined yet.
Mhm.
One protester was killed, and three people died from medical conditions that were unrelated to what happened that day. So, I don't want to dismiss the seriousness of what happened on January the 6th, but if you compare that to what happened on 9/11, the ratio is 3,000 to 1.
Right.
So, just saying.
Yeah, it's funny that you. I always try my best, obviously, to keep up, keep informed and read articles as opposed to read headlines. And I assume that more people obviously died. I thought it was at least like three or so of the cases I heard. I definitely heard or at least the common narrative was that the police officer or the guard was like killed by a fire extinguisher or bashed in by
And that's no longer, and
yeah.
that is being questioned right now.
Hmm.
There's been a lot of articles in the U.S. media saying it might not be as accurate as
But I
people
guess the
said it was.
problem is now the news cycle's over and there's no. It's
Yes,
most people probably
yes,
came out, including myself, probably came out with the idea that that probably
yeah,
happened and there's no follow up
and
because
that'll be the assumption you work on, right?
yeah. Um, moving on to kind of where we're at today.
Yeah.
So Borealis Threat at Risk and Consulting is kind of the project that you actively work on right now, where it's kind
Hmm.
of like almost like a social media presence or like an education presence
Hmm.
where you kind of, well, at least the content I've seen is you do like a little bit of podcasts on terrorism or
Hmm.
counterterrorism. You run a little YouTube channel and you kind of seem to either reach out or people reach out to you to, hop on political shows and talk about terrorism because obviously it's an
Yep.
extremely complicated topic. Foreign policy is also, a topic that most people should not be talking about unless they have experience about. So they kind of have you on to, kind of guide them through some of these complicated matters. Obviously, you mentioned, how difficult it is to even define terrorism, right? So
Right.
talking about it is way more of a complicated issue. Um, do you want to talk about kind of what you've been up to? I think you've just mentioned obviously earlier that you recently published your book,
Yep.
or one of your books. I think you've written five so far, um,
6.
or six, sorry. You want to talk about some of those a bit? Maybe what you do day to day in terms of like Borealis
Sure.
threat and risk consulting, that kind of idea.
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that my kids, I've got 3 children, um, told me a couple years ago, very very lovingly. They said, Dad, we adore you, but you clearly suck at retirement. So I've been retired for almost 6 years from the federal government. In those 6 years, I've written 6 books, so a book a year. I've done thousands of blogs, hundreds of podcasts. I was a regular columnist for the Hill Times, which is Canada's parliamentary newspaper, as a terrorism reporter for 3 years. I've done op-ed pieces across the country. I've traveled around the world talking about terrorism. Um, what I'm trying to do with all of this is I'm basically trying to encourage conversation. As we've agreed, these are very complex issues. They tend to get dismissed, or um, they tend to be described in ways that are not factual. There's a lot of emotion around this. Surprise, surprise. It's about people killing people. Of course, there's going to be a lot of emotion around it, a lot of politics around it. And people have some very well entrenched positions on what they think it is and what they think it isn't. And all I'm trying to do is let's talk about these things.
Right.
Okay. Put your facts on the table. Let me give you a very simple example. Especially since the 6th of January of this year, but even in the year and a half before that, the narrative that's going around most circles in the West is that right-wing extremism, right-wing terrorism is the greatest threat to Western democracy. Okay. In other words, groups like Al Qaeda and Islamic State and Boko Haram in Nigeria, those guys are yesterday's news. They had their day in the sun. You don't have to worry about them anymore. And I've been saying, well, let's look at numbers. So there's a fascinating report that comes out every year called the Global Terrorism Index. It's produced by an Australian think tank called the Institute for Economics and Peace. A bizarre kind of combination, but it is what they do. And the 2020 report, the reports usually come out in December or January, and they cover the previous year. So the 2020 report just came out. And the report said, we have good news. The numbers of deaths due to terrorism have fallen for the 5th year in a row. So the report began in 2015. About 18 or 19,000 people died that year because of terrorism. Last year, 14,000 people died. So this is in 2019. They're always a year behind. 14,000 people died from terrorist attacks in 2019. And the report said, we're really worried about the rise of far right extremism. Out of those 14,000 people, 89, less than 100, were killed by right wing terrorists. And 51 of those died in one attack. That was an attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, in February of that year. So out of 14,000 deaths, 89 were killed by right-wing extremists. Who do you think killed the other 13,911?
Obviously, yeah, you can answer it. Sure.
Yeah, Islamist extremists for the most part. Now there's probably a few Hindu attacks, there's maybe a few Jewish attacks, but 99.9% of all the attacks in the world in 2019 were carried out by Islamist extremists. And here's another statistic which people tend to ignore. 99% of the victims of those attacks were Muslims.
Mm,
So, when a terrorist attack occurs in Iraq, the victims are Muslim. When an attack occurs in Afghanistan, the victims are Muslim. When an attack occurs in Somalia, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Niger, in Yemen, in Syria, in Pakistan, the victims are Muslim. So a lot of people get very upset when you say, well, I don't want you talking about Islamist extremism. You sound like you're Islamophobic. And I say, I'm not Islamophobic because the victims are Muslim.
right.
I'm trying to point out that yes, the perpetrators pretend to be Muslim because they practice an aberrant, non-normative form of Islam, but the victims are just average Muslims. That's the tragedy in all this. Anyhow, the reason I'm talking about this, Matt, is that the facts don't support the contention that the far right is the greatest threat.
You
And I'm
mentioned
not saying there isn't a threat. Absolutely, there's a threat from the far right, but on a global scale, the vast majority of victims and the vast majority of people are killed by Islamist terrorists.
the report itself. The report that they released, they said specifically that the right wing terrorism was the most or was
Was the
this
most worrisome. They're talking about a worrisome rise in right wing terrorism.
right?
And that was right in the executive summary.
And this was the
But
same report that collected the numbers.
yes,
Okay.
because they're like I said, the narrative is shifting, and we now have, and I just read this recently. We now have groups that want Western governments to stop talking about Islamist terrorism.
Hmm.
So the very term they don't like. What else do you want us to call it? It is what it is. These people, people say, well, Islamist terrorists have nothing to do with Islam. Well, I beg to differ because you can't get two words within a statement issued by Islamic State or Al Shabaab or Boko Haram or Al Qaeda that does not contain a reference to the Quran or a reference to the Hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. I'm not saying they're mainstream. I'm not saying they're normative. In fact, they're not.
Yep.
I'm not Muslim. I happen to know a lot about Islam, and it's not normative Islam the way I understand it. But to say it has nothing to do with Islam is a blatant disregard for the facts.
Yeah, I think
You can't get there from there.
especially one of the interesting things I kind of read. I think picking up one of these books and having someone actually read it and look through it. One of the interesting things I found is these people get radicalized to the point of which, like their own mosque, for example, kicks them out because they see
Yeah.
they have like this extreme radical behavior that's not normal to what I guess normal Muslims or
Yeah.
what they practice. Obviously, you're not trying to be Islamophobic or anything like that. These people are obviously just extremely radical for even the normal Muslim person, right?
Well, exactly, and the mosques want nothing to do with them. First of all, they don't like the rhetoric that they spout. They also don't want them hanging around because they're going to radicalize other people in the mosque.
Hmm.
So they chase them out, which I completely understand. The problem is if you kick them out but don't tell anybody, they're going to go somewhere else.
Hmm.
And I've seen this in my career. They create their own mosques, or they go online and they find audiences online. So you know, kicking the can down the road is rarely a good strategy because the problem doesn't go away. It just goes down the road. And part of what we were doing with this cross country program that I was involved with in 2013 to 2015 was to say, we understand the sensitivity about this. We understand you feel stigmatized by this language. But for God's sakes, if you see people engage in these kinds of activities, you've got to tell somebody. You just can't pretend it's not there or just, you know, prevent them from entering your facility anymore. That doesn't solve the problem. It displaces the problem. And that's what you don't want to have happen. You want somebody to be able to talk to these people. And in some cases, if somebody is just dabbling in the water of these types of ideas, maybe you can pull them back. But if somebody is deeply involved, you want to stop them before they kill somebody. And that means reporting them to law enforcement. And if an investigation ensues and they get arrested and charged, then so be it. At least you're stopping bad things from happening.
Right. Um, yeah. So I guess I'm just gonna throw out some random questions for you or thoughts and ideas,
Sure.
just for the remaining time we have. Um, he kind of mentioned in the book, or at least in the book I read, that you think of the internet as kind of like a force multiplier as opposed to
Hmm.
the internet radicalizing people. Do you kind of still kind of hold that same kind of view that you think like these people would find a different way to be radicalized, like if it wasn't through the internet, or do you think the internet is actually radicalizing people today?
The internet it's a forum, right? You don't get radicalized by the internet, you get radicalized on the internet. And I think what the internet has done and other social media platforms is it has allowed anybody sitting in their bedroom or their basement or in a internet cafe or on their iPhones, whatever, to download and consume information from anywhere in the world. And that was a much harder in the old days. So just give you an example. Um, when the Iranian Revolution took place in 1979 in Iran, the way in which the message was spread was by cassette tapes. So cassette tapes were smuggled out of Iran into expatriate communities. Ayatollah Khomeini used to live in France, for example, before he went back to Iran. He would record his sermons. And they'd mail them out in cassette tapes because that was the technology at the time. When Al Qaeda was big in Saudi Arabia in the early 90s, they would use fax machines to get their statements out. So every generation will have its own technology to get its message out.
Right.
Right now, it's the internet and social media. What's been happening lately is that there's been a lot of pressure brought to bear on Facebook, on Twitter, on Telegram, on you name it, to take this stuff off, to deny these people a platform. And that's good because there was far too much hateful garbage out there. The problem is that just because you can't go on Facebook doesn't mean you can't go on 4chan. Or
Mhm.
if 4chan kicks you off, you go on 8chan. Or if 8chan kicks you off, you go on another platform. I mean, how many social media platforms are out there?
Right.
Hundreds? Thousands? Tens of thousands? I have no idea, right? I know the ones that I use. Again, it's displacing the problem. So it's good that um, we're taking space away from these individuals to spread their hateful messages, but the hateful messages are still there
Right.
and they're being posted in other venues. So maybe the strategy is if we take enough of those platforms away, there's nowhere left to go. But I'm sorry. I mean, how many apps get created on a daily basis around the world?
Yeah, it doesn't seem
Thousands.
realistic.
Yeah.
Do you
So in other words, you're playing whack-a-mole with messaging, and that's rarely a good idea either.
Do you think at that point you kind of just kind of broaden the platforms to include these people so that maybe they have the potential chance to maybe hear a view that isn't aligned with them to maybe shift them away? Do you think that that's kind of kind of the point that we're at, like something like an opposing worldview as opposed to because I mean you kick these people off, they go on their their sub little genre, their
Yeah.
little echo chamber, and from there on out they won't hear like another thought. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that's kind of the only way we kind of have to take this issue on?
I, I think it's a great strategy, and certainly it all depends. And you refer to my book, my first book, The Threat from Within. It depends where the person is on their own personal journey to the embodiment of violence for political or ideological purposes or religious purposes. Some people aren't going to change. And it's interesting that you're asking me this question because I'm going to do a podcast later on this evening with a woman who does works in prisons in Australia with people who have been incarcerated for terrorism offenses. And can you turn them back? Can you get them to reject the ideas that brought them there in the first place? It's a fascinating question. As somebody who worked in security intelligence, I'm naturally a skeptic because people say all kinds of things. And these we used to joke. I used to go to prisons and talk to prisons officers. They used to joke, how many people if you talk to prisoners, how many of them are guilty? None. They were all falsely accused. They were all falsely incarcerated. So if you talk to 100 terrorist prisoners and they all say, "Oh yeah, yeah, we don't believe that anymore." Where's the reliability in that? And we've had a few cases in the United Kingdom of people who've been released after so-called counseling programs who have killed people in acts of terrorism. So I'm not trying to say that all people are like that, but it's really really hard to figure out. So there certainly are individuals that if you were to invite into a larger forum, you might be able to sort of draw them back from the edge. But there's the very died, hard and true people that are never going to change their minds. So if you invite them onto forums, you actually give them another forum to recruit from.
Right.
And I'll tell you just briefly a personal story. One of the outreach sessions that we did, I won't say where it was. A person showed up and started yelling at us and arguing with us that what we were doing there and why are we, singling out Muslims for this kind of attention. And I found that this very strange thing. And I later learned that this individual was actually had just returned from fighting abroad with a terrorist group. And the thing that frightened me most that evening is that there were a couple people in the audience that looked at him like he was a hero. So here's somebody who joined a forum, and this is a real world as opposed to an online forum, with a distinct purpose to recruit other people to follow him. So that would be the danger you would, I think, run into if you were to if you try to bring on somebody who isn't going to change their minds. They might find people that they could draw into the same patterns and the same worldview that they did.
Yeah.
But I know, but for people that are kind of just dithering, yeah, I think that's a workable
Yeah.
strategy.
Yeah, obviously an extremely hard question that I wish everyone would have the answer to, but yeah. Um, I guess maybe just a final question. Do you have any like
Sure.
current day event or like current foreign policy issue that people should be aware about that they're not today? If you had to like pick something off the top of your head.
Yeah, the you know we're living in this, like as I said, this post 9/11 period, where when you look at threats, people see terrorism as the only threat out there. It isn't by far. So, long story short, when CSIS was created back in 1984, it came out of the old RCMP security service. I won't go into the rigmarole. It's all in this book about why CSIS was created. It was largely what's called a CI organization, a counterintelligence organization, because this was still during the Cold War. And then 9/11 happened, and then everyone kind of dropped CI, counterintelligence, and started doing CT, counterterrorism. The people who were trying to spy on us didn't quit. The Russians were spying on us. If you heard the speech by the CSIS director 2 weeks ago, David Vigneault, he was quite openly telling Canadians, "Here's who's spying on us. Here's what keeps me awake at night." I think what concerns me is that most people are black and white. Most people are very simplistic. They can only think of one thing simultaneously. So we've been thinking terrorism, 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 terrorism for the past 20 years. And now we're moving away from Islamist terrorism, right wing terrorism, which is a real threat. I'm not denying that. What is the threat from counterintelligence? What is the threat from cyber attacks? It's huge, right? Again, David Vigneault said what worries him is the amount of Canadian proprietary knowledge being stolen on a daily basis by foreign powers like China, like North Korea, like Russia. And what concerns me is that most Canadians don't get that, either because they don't care, or couldn't be bothered to take the time, or it's too complicated. As I said, say to people, I can't spell cyber. Why would I care about it? Well, because somebody's probably attacking you on your computer right now, and so you have to care about it. You don't have to become an expert in it, but you have to rely on those who do know their things. And the other part that also worries me is the incredible proliferation of experts. Um, Most people who call themselves experts are not. And this is one reason why I refuse to be referred to as an expert, because the term has become meaningless. No true expert calls themselves an expert. Because I know even in my life, working in security intelligence for 32 years, writing 6 books on terrorism, I have a lot to learn. And I would never call myself an expert. I'm constantly picking up new things every day. And I just wish people were a little more modest in describing their own skill sets and their own knowledge. Bottom line though, Canada is a fairly safe country, at least when you compare it to places like Afghanistan or Somalia or Pakistan or Iraq or Syria. And we should be happy about that, but it doesn't mean there aren't threats out there, whether they're terrorist threats or espionage threats or cyber threats. We're a lucrative target for many reasons. I guess I just wish that Canadians were a little more aware of it, and that Canadians um, put their faith in institutions like CSIS, like the RCMP, like CSE. These are women and men that go to work every day with one thing and one thing in mind only: how do I keep Canada safe today? And I think they're due some respect, and they're due an acknowledgement of what they're trying to do.
Oh, you're correct. Thank you for joining me. Um,
My pleasure.
Obviously, people can find you at I'll link your YouTube where you kind of have like these
Mhm.
quick hits, quick hits, I
Yep.
think. Those are
Mhm.
basically like 10-minute segmented podcasts
Yep.
where you just kind of talk about a topic. You also have the longer form podcasts if you want to tune in on those. You also appear sometimes on political kind of shows on YouTube as well. I've seen you
Yep.
on. Obviously, you have your 6 books you mentioned as well. So if you are interested in obviously reading about this, because it's a pretty important topic, or if you're interested in, um, I don't know, the field itself, yeah, check out all those resources because you do quite a lot of content on that. So
Yeah.
I
Well, thanks.
appreciate you. Yeah.
No, thanks for having me. So, just a quick note that this book is available now on my website. It is self-published. You can't find it anywhere else just yet, although I just put it up on Amazon Kindle this morning. It takes a few days to get there, but if you want a copy, it's only $25 Canadian, and it basically runs through security intelligence in Canada and terrorism from Confederation to the present. You can order a copy on my website. And I just want to say, Matt, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a fascinating conversation, and I'd love to join you again at some point to talk about other things.
Yeah, for sure. I try my best this conversation. Obviously, we're throwing around quite a lot of terms, and foreign policy is an extremely hard topic. I feel uncomfortable talking about it personally, but I appreciate you coming on, giving us some background, and talking about your career path. So thanks.